All right, boys. It's time for the Bible story, David and Goliath. All right. Israel's first king was named Saul. King Saul did not obey God, so God said to Samuel the prophet, "Find a man named Jesse. One of his sons will be the new king." Samuel found Jesse in Bethlehem. He looked at 7 of Jesse's sons. They looked handsome and strong, like Daddy. "Not them," God said. "I don't care about looks. I care about what's in a person's heart." Jesse sent for his youngest son, David, who was tending sheep in the fields. Samuel saw him, and God said, "He's the one." So David was anointed the new king. Sometime later, Israel fought the Philistines. A giant Philistine soldier called Goliath challenged the Israelites to send a champion to fight him, but the Israelites were too afraid. See how big he was. You see that?
Yeah.
David brought food to his brothers in the army, and he heard Goliath's challenge, and he was not afraid. "How dare he defy God's army?" asked David. "I will fight him." That would be Judah. I think Judah would do that. All right. Surprised King Saul offered David his armor. "No," said David. "God helped me kill wild beasts. He will help me against Goliath too." David took 5 stones and a sling. Do you know what a sling is?
No.
It's like a slingshot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So.
And then listen to what Goliath said. "Am I a dog?" Goliath roared. "You send this stick of a boy to fight me? You have a spear," said David, "but I have the help of Israel's God." David put a stone in the sling and threw it. It struck Goliath's forehead and knocked him down. The Israelites defeated the Philistines with God's help. David was a hero. Yay, David. Hey, what do you think that story means? What do you think that story means?
That God can help you defeat people.
Okay. What do you think it means?
I think it means the kid won.
That the kid won?
Yes.
All right.
Oh wait, I have another one.
Oh wait, you have another one? What?
That even if you're little, then you can defeat a giant person.
Oh. That sounds like a good... All right.
So Nolan, even if you're little, even if Gracie is little, Gracie can probably defeat Daddy. If Gracie is little and with God's help. If I actually see a big monster, I will punch him in the stomach.
Right. You just punch that monster right in the stomach.
And kick.
And then kick him.
In the face.
In the face.
How small is the monster? Punch him in the nugget.
It doesn't matter how big the monster is. We just read the story of David and Goliath. That's true. It means little guys can beat big guys, right?
Is he going to jump really high if it's as big as Goliath? Then he has to jump really high and kick him in the face like...
That was like Matrix. Good stuff right there.
Jump me up!
All right.
Are we like that?
I like it.
Good night.
All right. Good night, guys.
Good night, guys.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to a very special lunch with PB&J. As you just saw, or heard, we are starting a brand new series called Bedtime Stories. Good morning.
Good morning. We're excited about it.
Yeah, we've been excited about this one for a few weeks, and so we thought we'd start off with letting you hear the kid version of the Bible story that we're going to be talking about today, David and Goliath. If you didn't pick up on that, that's what we're fighting.
Yes.
Or that's what we're fighting. That's what we're talking about.
Y'all like our shirts?
And hey, shout out to Sandra and Uptown Crafters for the Lunch with PB&J podcast gear.
Now we really are.
We officially have sponsors, and we feel professional now. And even though this is probably the least professional coming into it that we felt, we feel very intimidated talking about a classic Bible
it's because
story.
I'm excited. There's so much here. It's so meaty. I'm excited.
I've always thought there was a lot to this story.
Yeah.
And I've always known that. I've preached on this story a couple times over the years. And but man, going through it this time was just amazing. at everything that's there. And so we want to get into it. I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, it's going to take us at least a couple of weeks to get through all of this story. All right. So this is not your 5-minute Bible story that we read as kids or were told in Sunday school. We're going to go and take a deep dive into this story. We're going to go back a little ways, give you a little context of what was going on, and all of those things as well. And so buckle up, hang on, get something to eat, something to snack on. All right, get a coffee or something with you, a glass of water, whatever it is, warm glass of milk. Bedtime Story. See what I did there?
I need cookies.
All right, so some warm glass of milk and some cookies, and we're gonna jump in. And so I think that's it. Did I need to say anything else to begin with? No.
Nope.
All right, so we're gonna stop at some point, but we just so you know, we are just gonna talk until we're done, and then we'll cut it up later, and it's gonna be presented to you as one like kind of professional thing, but it's not that professional because we're not that professional. All right, so let's start off with a little bit of a context background. As you just heard, our boys, Judah and Nolan, just told you what they felt like this story was all about. And usually when you ask a kid, I don't know if you picked up on what Nolan said or not. He said he was going to fight that. If some giant came up to him, he'd, what was it? He'd punch him in the stomach and then kick him in the nuggets.
That's code for something else in our house.
All right, that's the Booth version of that. All right. But if you ask kids normally, hey, what does the story of David and Goliath mean? You're going to get something along the lines of David was very brave and courageous, which he was.
Yeah.
You're going to get, I think one of the guys just said it there, is little people can do big things. Or I think they said kids can do big things too, which is very true. And so you get kind of different versions of that is kind of what it usually comes. So we're going to tell the big kid version, all right? We're going to tell the big version of it. And so I want to give you a little bit of context, though, first, okay? So the battle that they were fighting, David versus Goliath, wasn't just David versus Goliath. It was Israel versus the Philistines. And who were the Philistines? Let's talk about that for a second. So the earliest mention of the Philistines is actually, you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 10. The Philistines had contact with Abraham and with Isaac, and so this is a long fought battle between these two nations.
Right.
Most of the battles had to do, it kind of revolved around, there's obviously religious differences, where the Philistines were pagans, worshipped false gods and that kind of thing, and then Israel obviously was the people of God, the nation of God. And there was a lot of resentment, I guess you could say. You're going to find that word in the Bible about this, but there's also a lot of the Philistines saw the power that Israel had. They were victorious whenever they fought a battle. They were usually victorious. They were taking over a lot of land, a lot of territory, and the Philistines took exception to that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of power grab that was going on during that time. So they'd had contact with Abraham and Isaac. They're mentioned in Exodus. I thought this was interesting. Again, you know all this stuff because you read it, right? But it's fascinating sometimes to put all the pieces together.
Right.
And so in Exodus chapter 13, you have the Israelites have just crossed the Red Sea. Moses is leading them towards the Promised Land. And then as soon as they come across the Red Sea, the shortest route to go from the Red Sea to the Promised Land would have actually been to go through the Philistine territory. It would have been to go through there. But it says in Exodus 13 that God actually detoured them around that route because he wasn't ready for the Israelites to fight because he felt like they would have been discouraged if they would have had to go to war that soon.
Yeah.
And the Philistines were known as a warmongering people. This is what they did, is they just kind of terrorized the people around them. They fought in a lot of wars. And so I think it's kind of interesting. They were very aggressive. And so God was like right away, he didn't want the children of Israel having to fight any wars. Now, obviously, They fought wars.
Right.
Even during the 40 years where they wandered in the wilderness, they fought wars. But God's like, man, they've been through a lot.
It's not time for it.
They've been through a lot. And you made a comment. I was
Yeah.
telling you that earlier. I forget. You said something along the lines of like, even our battles
Yeah.
are ordained by God.
Yeah.
Like God's not going to let you fight. He's not going to let you fight until you're ready
And
to
thank
fight.
goodness he knows when we're ready and when we're not.
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. So again, the Philistines go all the way back to there. They were made up of the Philistines were kind of a civilization that were built around 5 autonomous cities. In other words, these 5 cities that controlled their own fate. They had their own kings, they had their own rulers and armies. They had their own of everything, so they were autonomous, and yet they fought as a collective. Now, sometimes they fought on their own, and so there's a couple instances of that where just those cities went to war on their own. But then most of the time, when they were fighting larger battles, these 5 cities, these 5 kings would come together to fight a common enemy. One of the cities that were part of this was the city known as Gath, which is where Goliath was from. That's where his folks were from. That's where they hailed from. Kind of interesting. There's a lot of, so again, Israel and the Philistines fought for hundreds of years against each other. And we're going to read from 1 Samuel here today in this story. And in just 1st and 2nd Samuel, the Philistines and the Israelites, they battle about 13 times. Israel wins 10 of those. The Philistines win 2, and there's a draw. All right, so you can say Israel is 10-2-1 in their fights against the Philistines. And what's interesting when you look at the details of the story is when Israel trusted in God, when they put their faith in God, they won the battle.
Yeah.
They won the fight, all right? The 2 times that they lost, the first time that they lost, you can read about it, is the Israelites it was the sons of Eli, they took the ark, they were losing the battle, and so they took the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the presence of God, they took the Ark of the Covenant out onto the battlefield, which was strictly forbidden.
Yeah.
They weren't supposed to do that, and because of that, they lost. There's a fascinating story around that. The Philistines capture the ark. They take it. They put it into their temple with their false god Dagon. When they come in the next morning, Dagon has fallen over. They stand Dagon back up, the statue. They come back the next day. Dagon has fallen over again. The head has fallen off of Dagon. And everybody's like, oh, man, we've made a mistake.
I don't think that's coincidence.
We probably need to get rid of this. And so they actually give the ark back to Israel because they recognize Israel's God is way bigger than theirs. The second time they lose is actually when Saul, the king, who is the king when Goliath, this battle takes place. Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in that battle, so that takes place after this.
Yeah.
And then the draw is actually a time where Israel loses its nerve and they hide. And so they just.
So what you're saying too is this is not the first time they're about to fight.
This is not the first time they have come up against the Philistines in battle. All right. So that's the Philistines.
Yeah.
The other side of this battle, the Israelites.
Yeah.
So where was Israel during this time? Where were they as a nation? Now, before Saul became the king. All right. Now Saul was the first king of Israel. Before that, they had already God had always ruled the Israelites. He said, "You will be my people. I will be your God." He wanted to be the one. They took directions from him, and the way that God did that was through judges and the prophets. And so God would speak to them, and then they would give the word to the people. So Samuel was the judge and the prophet at this time, or just before this. And Samuel was awesome. Everybody liked Samuel. He did a great job. He'd actually led Israel into victories against the Philistines. All right. And Israel had started to drift away from God. Samuel was actually the one that brought them back. But then as Samuel got older, people started talking. They decided we don't want to be ruled by judges anymore. We want a king like all of the neighbors, all the nations around us. Yeah. We want a king. So Samuel didn't like it. Now, this is kind of interesting. So we're going to go back a little bit. 1 Samuel chapter 8. This is Samuel's reaction to the request that Israel wants a king. It says in chapter 8, verse 6, Samuel was displeased with their request and went to the Lord for guidance. Do everything they say to you, the Lord replied. For it is me they are rejecting, not you.
Yeah.
They don't want me to be their king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me and followed other gods. And now they are giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them.
Yeah.
And so God says, listen, Samuel's all upset. He's like, man, I thought I did a pretty good job. I don't understand why they'd want to change here. God, you're their king.
Right.
I'm the voice. You know, it's working out great. They say no. God says, listen, Samuel, don't take it personally. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me.
Right.
He says, ever since I've brought them out of Egypt, they've continued to rebel, continue to turn away from me. And so he said, do what they want, but let them know it's not going to work out. So if you continue reading Samuel, 1 Samuel 8, Samuel gives them the warning, says, guys, this is not a good idea. It's not a good plan, but God's going to do what you want. And so he does. And sure enough, everything Samuel warns them will happen is absolutely what happens. All right. So Israel wanted a king. God gave him a king. The first king that they have is a guy by the name of Saul. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. What? It says that he is a big dude. Must be where the name comes from. He's a big dude. Not only a big dude, he's a good-looking man. All right? Tribe of Benjamin.
I wouldn't be smack dogging too much.
I know. It doesn't turn out well for Saul, so I don't know why I'm so proud of this. I'm not from the tribe of Benjamin. Anyway, immediately, Saul is tested when he becomes king. He wins the battle. In most kingdoms, the throne, right? When you're a king, it gets passed on down to your sons.
Right.
But from early on in Saul's reign as king, he shows, and this is Saul's great downfall, is he cares more about what other people think of him than obeying God.
Right.
All right. So this becomes the downfall of Saul. Early on, God tells Samuel, I'm going to reject Saul as king. What he means by that at that time is that Saul can continue to be king for now, but the throne will not be passed on to Jonathan or any of Saul's other sons. And so throughout his kingship, I guess, his reign is tainted by disobedience to God, superstition. There's a time where he makes an oath and says, we will not eat until we win. And what happens is all the soldiers don't eat.
Yeah.
And so then they go to fight.
They have no energy.
And they have no energy. They have no strength. And Jonathan's the only one that eats because he didn't know. Anyway, it's a whole thing. But it's like superstition and different things like this. But God continued to protect Israel. Why? Because he is their God and they are his people, right? So, but then in Samuel chapter 14, let me find this one real quick. Samuel chapter 14. A couple verses here. It says, now when Saul had secured his grasp on Israel. So this just shows that Saul was a great military. God was giving him victories, okay? Because he was protecting the nation. It says, when Saul had secured his grasp on Israel's throne, he fought against his enemies in every direction, against Moab, Ammon, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and who?
Philistines.
The Philistines. And wherever he turned, he was victorious. He performed great deeds and conquered the Amalekites, saving Israel from all those who had plundered them. The point is this. Saul had already fought the Philistines and he'd won.
Yeah.
That's the point that I want you to get, all right? But God finally rejects Saul. Says, I can't even with this guy, Joy. He says, I can't even do it. Imagine Joy was Samuel. He's like, I can't even with Saul anymore. I just can't do it anymore. And so he rejects Saul completely. He tells Samuel to anoint David as king.
Yeah.
All right. And then the first time David and Saul get to meet each other actually isn't on the battlefield. I think a lot of people think that that's the first time that David comes to know Saul or Saul comes to know David, but that's not true. If you go look at 1 Samuel chapter 16, let me read just some of this story, okay? Starting at verse 14, it says, now the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and the Lord sent a tormenting spirit that filled him with depression and fear. What happens when the Spirit of God leaves you? right? And
Depression and
so
fear.
there's so much rebellion,
Yeah.
so much disobedience. God finally said, that's it, I'm done, I've had it,
Yeah.
I can't even with Saul anymore, something's got to change, all right? So the Spirit of God leaves Saul.
Yeah.
What happens now is a tormenting spirit comes in. Saul routinely now is getting filled with depression, and he's afraid. This guy that has won victory after victory after victory after victory is now filled with fear. Verse 18, one of the servants said to Saul, one of Jesse's sons from Bethlehem is a talented harp player. Not only that, he's a brave warrior, a man of war, and has good judgment. He is also a fine-looking young man, and the Lord is with him.
Yeah.
This is describing David. Verse 21, so David went to Saul and began serving him. Saul loved David very much, and David became his armor bearer, which, just FYI, is a very important part and a very trusted role. An armor bearer is somebody that took care of the armor for somebody.
Yeah.
All right? And so it was a very important role, very trusted role. So it shows that Saul loved David and he trusted David.
Yeah.
Then verse 22, then Saul sent word to Jesse asking, please let David remain in my service, for I am very pleased with him. And whenever the tormenting spirit from God troubled Saul, David would play the harp. Then Saul would feel better and the tormenting spirit would go away. There's 1,000 things we could talk about in this, about God sending tormenting spirits and all that stuff. Wrong bedtime story, all right? That's a bedtime story for another day. I just want you to see this. Saul already knew David. There's some significance to this little exchange, all right? David didn't just randomly show up, all right? He didn't just show up on the battlefield. Saul already knew him.
Yeah.
He knew his reputation as a fighter, all right? I'll be honest with you, I'd missed that before.
Yeah. Yeah.
I never really noticed that before, but it says that not only, I always thought they brought him in because he's a great musician.
Yeah.
Guy can rock it out and play some soothing tones. It's like Kenny G on a harp, all right? That's a throwback. Some of you don't even know who Kenny G is, do you? All right? But he's a talented harp player, but it said not only that, he was known as a brave warrior and a man of war.
Yeah.
All right? David was a fighter, always had been a fighter, had a reputation as that.
I think
okay?
we just think of him as the shepherd and the harp player.
Yeah, we have
at
this picture of a
point.
kid, right? And as a kid, so we don't think of him of having done that. So Saul knew him, he trusted him. Saul loved him.
Mm-hmm.
And so God gave David, this was the other thing I thought was interesting, is here David is the son of a shepherd, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jesse, he's spending his days out in the field for the most part, but he's been anointed to be king.
Yeah.
He has no right whatsoever to be in the throne room of the kingdom of Israel. And yet God makes
God
a way
put him
for
there.
David
Right.
to be in the presence of the king, to be in the room with the position. One day, to be in the position, this is the position he's going to fill. And he knows that.
Yeah.
And God makes a way for him to be in there. And I read that and I thought, man, how much did David glean? How much did he learn just from being in that place?
Yeah.
So.
And not getting prideful, but just staying in a place of humility. Too.
Absolutely.
That's amazing.
And so we also learn in this little exchange that the Spirit of the Lord has left Saul. He's being tormented. And actually that same tormenting spirit after David defeats Goliath, that same tormenting spirit would mess with Saul's head so much that he would actually try to kill David on several different occasions. So there's the context. There's the buildup, all right? A long buildup to it, but it's all pretty important as we go through, okay? So now we're going to get into our story. Do you have anything to add so far? No? All right. I'm doing all the talking. She's going to kick in here in a sec. All right, so Israel, as we get into our story, these are the highlights of what I just read. We need to understand that Israel is facing a very familiar foe.
Yeah.
All right, they have fought the Philistines over and over again. They've done it under the leadership of Saul, and they have won on multiple occasions. They have already defeated this army. And when they've defeated them, they have been outnumbered. All right, there's a couple battles where they were like grossly outnumbered in manpower, but also fighting. The Philistines were known for their work with weapons, where Israel often fought with, I think, like iron weapons, like very heavy labors. The Philistines fought with bronze, and it was very lightweight, very strong, and so, but Israel always won because God was on their side. The difference now in this fight is the Spirit of God is no longer with Saul. He is the king by title, but the true spiritual leader is about to rise up.
The anointing's left him.
All right. This is why you don't fight wars. Don't fight battles without the anointing. Don't fight battles. Anyway. All right. So here we are. We're going into 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is where you will find the story of David and Goliath in your Bible. I hope you're reading along with us. If you're not right now, hit pause, jokers.
Go
all right?
get it.
Hit pause. Go get your Bible, get a notebook, get a pen, and start writing some notes. All right? So here we go. The Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Soka in Judah and Azekah at that place. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah, where the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. Then Goliath,
Dun, dun, dun.
a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. His coat weighed more than my wife does. He also wore bronze leg armor and carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. Did I mention their weapons were made out of bronze?
Yes.
The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam. Y'all know how heavy that is, right?
No.
How heavy and thick a weaver's beam is? Everybody knows. That's why they used it as I have no idea. I was going to look that up and I didn't. But apparently everybody knows how heavy that is. And it was tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. We're going to come back to the armor bearer towards the end. All right, so here we are. Goliath. Goliath has come out. Goliath from Gath, one of the 5 Philistine cities that I talked about a minute ago. By definition, he stood over 9 feet tall. All right, that's a big man. If you don't know, that's a big man.
You just get this imagery of this is a real person.
I had this. I don't know. I was studying today for this, and I just had images of the Princess Bride come into mind. There's a scene.
What's that guy?
Andre the Giant.
Yeah.
I had images of the scene where they're about to storm the castle.
Yeah.
And they're back there, and they're like, "How many men are there?" And he's like, "There's 30 men." They've got 30 men. How are we gonna feed them? Well, we have a giant or something. Anyway, so that's I think how the Israelites were responding. It's like, how are we gonna defeat them? They've got a giant. So anyway, so now what's interesting is we always say David fought Goliath. He was a giant. The Bible actually never calls Goliath a giant.
He's a giant to us.
He's a giant. He's just a big fella. He's just a big.
So with
he's a
you
big
saying
boy.
that, the Bible does refer to other people as giants. So in you saying that, are you insinuating that there's taller people than
Yes.
over 9 feet tall?
So I think there are. I think there's on the scale of what some people in the Bible appear to be. He was on the above average scale. He was on the high end of the height spectrum. All right. So this was not the first time that Israel and God's people had faced giants before. Okay. In Genesis chapter 6 is the first time that we see this word used in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 6 verse 4, it says there were giants in those days. Now those days means this is the Genesis chapter 6 is the story of Noah. It's the story of the flood, all right? And this is leading into why God sent the flood.
Yeah.
And so it says there were giants in those days, but it also says, and after that.
Yeah.
So in other words, before the flood and after the flood, there were giants. Now, there is no record saying that any of Noah's sons were giants.
Yeah.
Just for the record.
FYI.
Okay? So there were giants in those days and after that, whom the sons of God came unto when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bore them children. they became mighty men. All right? So, in other words, you got to read between the lines. There's a little hanky-panky between the sons of God and the daughters of men. What came out of that?
Giants.
Giants. All right? And now, this led to Noah's flood. The whole earth is destroyed. Everybody but Noah and his family are killed, and yet the giants come back. All right? Now, there's two main schools of thought when it comes to who the sons of God are. All right? So there is a school of thought that says the sons of God are actually the fallen angels. So there's a word that's used to describe the giants here, and it's the word Nephilim. And you'll see that in your Bibles, and you'll see it in different places throughout the Old Testament. Nephilim can be translated to fallen ones, and so some people take that to mean the fallen angels. So the Bible says that when Satan was cast out of heaven, he took a third of the angels with him. These are, when we talk about demonic forces or evil spirits, these are the third of the angels that were tossed out of heaven with Satan. So they were fallen angels. And so some people take this to mean that when it talks about the Nephilim or the fallen ones, that it is the fallen angels that they came. They reproduced with daughters, with human women. And the result of that were these tall, strong warrior fighters that became known as giants.
Wow.
All right. So the other school of thought is a little bit more along these lines, that there was, so if you go back to Adam and Eve, they had 3 sons. All right, we usually just talk about Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Cain killed Abel, so Cain was really, he was then shunned, and he was marked, and he is, all the descendants of Cain went wrong. They went sideways in a big way, okay? But then they had a 3rd son named Seth, and Seth was a follower of God, all right? And so some take this to mean that the fallen ones actually refer to the descendants of Cain, because Cain was fallen. He did not serve God. All right. Whereas Seth, his descendants, so it would be the fallen ones would be the descendants of Cain, and the daughters of men would be the daughters of Seth. And because they intermingled, believers and unbelievers, the result of that were these giants that took place.
I'd never heard that.
All right.
Version
So those are the two main schools of thought when it comes to this. So regardless of how you get there, all right, the offspring was really one that was born out of rebellion.
Right.
Okay. And so regardless of how you get there, they were known, these offspring were known for their height and their strength, and they resurfaced even after the flood. They resurfaced again, and they became really a thorn in Israel's flesh. And we see them talked about in different places. So in Numbers chapter 13, again, the children of Israel, they've come out of Egypt. They've wandered through the desert. They get to the promised land. They send out 12 spies to go and scope out the land. While there, they overlook the city, and they come back, and 10 of them have a bad report. 2 of them have a good report. The 10 say, there is no way that we can win. We look down there, and there are giants in the land. We look like grasshoppers to them. There's no way that we can defeat them. Joshua and Caleb are the 2 with the good report. They're like, yeah, they're big. I'll give you that. They're big, but God's fighting with us. So what's the problem? All right. So we see it mentioned in Numbers 13, the giants there. It's the same word. It's the Nephilim that's mentioned in Genesis. And they're too scared to fight. So that group that they see there are known as Anakim, the tribe of Anakim. And Anak, not Anakin, like in Star Wars.
Star Wars.
Anakim with an M at the end. And when they would come back later, all right, when they would come back later, Joshua would go and he would fight this war. He would go into the promised land, and giants and all, they were still there.
Yeah.
He chased them all out. He defeated them, and the survivors of this tribe actually went and relocated and settled in a city called Gath, which is again where Goliath is from. So the children of Israel, they've already fought this battle. They fought these giants. The descendants of Goliath have already fought the children of Israel and they lost. Okay? And then there's several other places in Deuteronomy chapter 2 and Amos chapter 2. There's another where they talk about giants. There's another group called Rephaim that are mentioned almost 20 times. Moses met up with the king of this group. His name was Og Baslam. And it said that he had a bed that was 13 feet long. All right? So forget your California king. This one's got it beat. All right? This dude was a big man. So all but a couple of occasions that I can think of or that I can find, the giants, when they're mentioned, they are mentioned in opposition to Israel. All right? And so I think that's important because as we go through this, again, how would you say like the giant is generally thought of?
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier before we started this, and it's this idea of giant. You know, when you hear the story, David and Goliath, a lot of people just view the giant as, well, this is whatever my problem is. You know, whatever I'm facing that's too big for me is the giant. You know, and as we read it, you know, I wanted him to bring out kind of the backstory because you're seeing it's not just a, you know, problem, whatever your problem you're facing, but it's really this demonic enemy.
Right.
That is represented here that David comes up against. And that's the adult version of this Bible story that I think it is important for us to see, is it's not just this Goliath is not just this giant. And whatever your problem that you're facing, oh, I got a flat tire, you know, oh, this is a problem today, or, you know, or I got this mountain in front of me. It's this idea of this was a demonic force that was constantly Israel was faced with, and David was there to say, "Hey, we've had enough."
Yeah.
You know, so that was the part I thought that a lot of times people see it in just the scenario of what is your problem you're facing.
Yeah, and I think again when you trace back the lineage, again, however you define the sons of God.
Yeah.
All right, whether you believe that it's the fallen angels or descendants of the line of Cain, the point is that these giants were birthed out of sin
and rebellion.
They were birthed out of sin and rebellion.
Yeah.
All right, and so there's no question that you can look at this story and say these giants are representative of sin. They're representative of rebellion. They're representative of demonic forces of Satan at work.
Yeah.
All right, and so that's I think that's an important point to understand. All right.
Before you go on,
yeah.
So that verse 4, it just mentions that he's a champion.
Yes.
I just wanted to understand that a little deeper and just explain what was a champion. Because like in those days in ancient armies, they would have like one person that would be their champion, like their best guy basically. And what they would do is they'd send champions out that would, you know, fight another person, another champion on the other side, and it would just be that one-on-one battle.
Yeah.
Versus like two armies coming together. So I think that is kind of an important thing to see of what's a champion. It's not just a guy that wins a lot of. They would send one guy out to represent the whole army.
Right. Yeah. So this is the fate of the nation.
Yeah.
Is and that's what's always fascinating me about this story. Honestly, is the fate of the nation.
Yeah.
Is at stake here. And so I think the biggest point to understand in the very beginning of this, all right, is just this idea that Goliath is not an abnormality. And what I mean by that is this was not the first time they had seen a giant, all right? This is not the first time they saw a really tall dude standing out on the battlefield. They had fought the Philistines before, and they won. All right, and I think that's really important to understand, because when we approach this, when we approach this story from a kid point of view or the way that we tell it, again, I keep cutting off my own head. I want you to see the bald glory of it all. Look at that. All right, is when we tell this story to kids, we put it in such a small box, in such a small time frame. You might be wondering, man, why did it take you 30 minutes to get here? The reason I took 30 minutes to get here is because I want you to understand they've been here before. They have fought this battle before, and they won. When we read the kid version of this story, it's like, oh my goodness, they've got a giant. We can't beat a giant. We've never seen a giant before. We're terrified of the giant.
Yeah, which is the way they're acting.
Which is the way that they're acting, and yet they've been here before, okay? So, again, we've got to stop looking at this story as simply, oh, they have a giant and the odds seem insurmountable.
Yeah.
This was a common win in the history of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
This was a common victory for them right here where they're standing. It was a common victory when the Spirit of God was with them.
Right.
When God was with them, they didn't have that fear. They weren't in terror. And so looking at this, what they needed at this point, they didn't need a strong fighter. They needed some faith.
Yeah.
All right. So let's keep going. Verse 8 says, Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. Why are you all coming out to fight? He called. I am the Philistine champion, as Joy just said, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. I just wanted to make this point again. This point here too is just when you do feel like you're faced. Again, we got to get our eyes off of this being a flesh and blood fight.
Yeah.
All right. I probably should have quoted earlier on. There's a verse in Ephesians talks about we wrestle not against flesh and blood,
Right.
but against principalities and powers and wickedness in high places. It's always been a spiritual battle. It always will be a spiritual battle. Whoever you think you're fighting, you're not fighting Goliath. You're fighting the spirit behind Goliath.
Right.
All right? You're not fighting your spouse. You're fighting the spirit that wants your marriage to come apart. You're not fighting your kids. You're fighting the spirit of rebellion maybe that's in your kids.
Yeah.
That spirit of defiance. You're not fighting your boss. You're not fighting your coworker. You're not fighting your neighbor. You're not fighting any of those people. You're not fighting yourself. All right? Your own head. You're not fighting your own head. You are fighting against principalities and spirits and wickedness in high places. All right? So you got to know who you're fighting against, but you also got to know who you're fighting for. Because get this. Did you hear what Goliath said? He said, but you are only the servants of Saul. He says, I'm a champion, but you're just the servants of Saul. That army... He looked over there and he just saw a bunch of guys that serve a king.
Yeah.
Now remember, I don't know if maybe a little bit before that, before they had a king, how were they viewed by their enemies? Were they viewed differently because they didn't have a king?
Yeah.
Then they knew that they were fighting against God. But now all of a sudden they're fighting servants of Saul. He downgrades them a little bit.
Right.
He says, you're only servants of Saul. He's demeaning. And this is what I think is the enemy. The devil is always going to try to minimize your position.
Yeah.
Right? It's always going to be things like this, like, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? I'm the champion. You're nothing. Your leader is nothing.
Yeah.
See, he was trying to get these men to be convinced that they followed Saul.
Yeah.
Their leader was nothing. He's terrified. He won't even come out and fight.
It is interesting because you think about why didn't he say, you're only the servants of God. You're only
Right.
the army of God. He didn't say that because there's power in that.
Yeah. Instead, he says, you won't come out. You're just the servants of Saul. And then he says, I defy the armies of Israel
Which
today.
means to challenge or resist or to dare.
Yeah. And he saw them as weak.
Yeah.
He just saw it as weak. And so verse 11, it says that they heard this. Saul and the army, they heard all of this. They're absolutely terrified. All right?
And before you go on,
Yeah.
I feel like, again, maybe it's because I'm looking for him, but I see Jesus in so much of the Old Testament that I read. And in going into that, Ben talks a lot about the foreshadowing. And so even just the way when Goliath says, he says, choose one man to come here and fight me. And he talks about he defies the armies of God. And then he asks, send me a man who will fight me. Send me a man who will fight me. And I just think about Jesus being our champion. And in Hebrews, it refers to Jesus as our champion, the one who initiates our faith. And so even when I read this story that, you look and you say, well, Jesus is not mentioned. To me, that's that foreshadow of he's about to come, and he's about to be the one that that's sent to face a big giant and to face the enemy. So I see Jesus in everything that I read like that too.
And just as you say that too, this is completely a side note, but if you want to hear an amazing song that goes along with this, Maverick City Music, incredible song called Champion. If you need to go, as you're reading them, when you get done here, you need to get fired up.
It'll take on a new meaning.
Fight, all right? Yeah, it'll take on a new meaning, all right? So go listen to that. All right, let's pick up verse 12. It says, now David was the son of a man named Jesse, and an Ephrathite.
That's how I'd say it.
All right, from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Jesse was an old man at the time, and he had 8 sons. Jesse's 3 oldest sons, Eliab, okay, you get the point. He had a bunch of sons. They had already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. Then look at this. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. They let this go on for 40 days and nights. One day Jesse said to David, take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers. And give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. Some snacks. See how your brothers are getting along and bring back a report on how they're doing. David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite Philistine forces joined forces against each other. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. So again, this went on for 40 days, and you might think, well, man, how did they do nothing for 40 days? Yeah. So if you go back to what we read in the beginning, this battlefield was set up on either side of a valley, and so both armies have the high position. The first person to go in the valley loses their position. Yeah. So both of them were. In reality, both of them were scared, all right? Neither one of them wanted to give up position, so they're both standing on either side. This is why it's allowed to go on for 40 days, and Goliath is the only one that has the boldness to walk out onto the battlefield, all right?
Before you go on, so it might not seem like much, but this verse, so I think it's 20, it says, he arrived, so David arrives at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. And that stood out to me because I'm like, no, wait, what? Like for 40 days, they're letting this Philistine taunt them. They're letting him taunt them. And then David comes on the scene and they're going off to battle. They're leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. And I just felt like, made me feel like, well, why? Like, what are they doing? What is that about? And it was almost comes across to me like they're playing this game. And it just brought into, again, when you take it and you say, what does this mean to me? I just feel like, they were shouting and they were crying about battle and they were getting themselves all hyped up, but they weren't actually going into battle. And I think about how we do that sometimes in our own lives. Like even, you go to church on Sunday and you shout and you cry and you pray and you sing and you get yourself all hyped up. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then we go home, throughout the week and we don't actually enter into spiritual battle.
Oh, come on, sister.
And so it made me think of, this looks like nothing, but yet what were they really doing there? They were pretending. They were playing a game. They're playing a game with their enemy. and their
man,
enemy
that's good.
knew it, you
Yeah.
know? So I just think I asked myself, that question of just, am I playing a game or am I actually prepared to enter into spiritual battle? Because it's two different things.
That's good. That's really good. It doesn't matter how much you come to church and shout and yell down. It doesn't matter how many scripture verses you got pinned up all over the place. It doesn't matter how many verses you highlight in your Bible.
Yeah.
Unless you're going to go out there and fight,
Right.
it's all kind of pointless.
Verse 24.
24? All right. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. Have you seen the giant? The men asked. He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give the man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes.
Poor girl.
David asked the soldiers standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" I gotta stop there.
Me too.
All right. Who is this pagan Philistine that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God? All right. He's
about to preach.
Out of everything, I'm trying not to, all right? But out of everything that I read in this one jumped out at me the most.
Yeah.
Of why are we allowing this to happen? We are the army. So notice David doesn't say we're the army of Saul. He says we are the army of the living God. He doesn't say he's defying us. He's not defying Saul. He's defying Israel. We are God's people. We are the army of God. Why are we allowing this to happen?
Yeah.
As Christians, we've got to understand who we serve and who we represent.
Right.
And when we have these giants, these demonic things in our lives trying to attack us,
Right.
at some point, it can't just be about crying out all these verses of, greater is he who's in me than who's in the world. And then meanwhile being in terror, being terrified of the enemy, being terrified to engage in a battle. David's like, why are you allowing this to happen?
Yeah.
Why are you allowing yourselves to be yelled at and heckled and screamed at like this? Why are we letting this happen? And if you get nothing else out of the story here, understand this is you have authority.
Yeah.
You have authority, and it's not in yourself. It's because of who you are and who you represent and whose side you're fighting on. The battle belongs to the Lord, and so it's just a matter of why aren't you guys tired out here? Like, why are we hiding? Why are we going through this charade? It seems more elegant when you say that.
We say charade in the South.
I know. Why? But it's when you're just why when you're disgusted, it's a charade. Why are we hiding? Why are we going through this charade? This is ridiculous. Why are we allowing the enemy to come in?
Yeah.
Hey guys, we're going to stop right there for this week. I hope you're enjoying it so far. I know today has been a lot of the context leading up to the big battle between David and Goliath, but we're going to pick up right where we leave off next week, so we hope that you will come back. In the meantime, do this for us. If you would share this video, be sure, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the little bell button at the top. You'll get notifications every time we release a new episode. If you're listening to us on iTunes or Spotify or Google Podcasts or wherever you're listening, we'd love for you to make sure that you follow us, but also do this. Leave us a rating and a comment. The more you interact with what we're doing, the more you interact with the podcast, the wider the spread is, the more people that find out about it and it pops up. It's just the way all the algorithms work, all right? So we want to make sure as many people as possible get exposed to the podcast so that they can find out more and more about Jesus through these simple conversations over lunch. All right. So guys, thank you so much. Once again, Sandra, those at Uptown Crafters, we thank you so much for the merch, for the t-shirts. They're awesome. If you guys need anything customized, printed, be sure to look up Uptown Crafters. They do a great job. All right. God bless, guys. Have a great week, and we will see you or talk to you next week on Lunch with PB&J.